This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's unsupervised learning.
Hey everybody, this is Razib here, and I am here with Dr. Tom Booth. Tom, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Dr. Tom Booth. I'm a senior research scientist at the Francis Crick Institute in London.
So I know Tom from his work on ancient DNA and archaeology. He's kind of operates at the interface of that right now, and one of the things that he has worked on. And if you have paid attention to the news and you are interested in ancient history, prehistory, you probably recognize the term Cheddar Man. Tom, could you tell us who Cheddar Man was?
Yeah, so he's the oldest, pretty much mostly complete skeleton that we have from Britain. He's been radiocarbon dated to about 10,000 years ago, and that's in this time period called the early Mesolithic, when people were still hunting and gathering and fishing in Britain, and when Britain was still connected to mainland Europe by a vast sort of lowland landscape known as Doggerland. And he was buried in a cave in a place called uh, Goff's Cave, which is near this little village called Cheddar, and that's where cheddar cheese comes from. So that's why he's called Cheddar Man. He's not actually made out of cheese, and in fact was lactose intolerant. So I don't know how he would feel about being. He wouldn't even really probably know what cheese was. But anyway, if he was here now. But yeah, and I mean that's the main thing. I mean, he was found a long time ago. It was found in 1903. Uh, so I mean, his sort of excavation now is archaeology. Now people go back and sort of find the old trenches that were used to dig him up. I mean, he was found because just from workmen digging a drainage trench, because at the time um, these caves, the Goss Cave, it was really big business for these Edwardians who were showing off these caves. They sort of took over these caves, and people paid to look around them, and they were sort of developing this new Goss Cave, as it was called, into a new exhibit, and that's when they found Cheddar Man.
Well, so you're saying that like people do archaeology on the area that they discovered him inadvertently. So it's like archaeology on archaeology, kind of.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, yeah, because as well, we don't really know whether Cheddar Man was the only thing that they found. It might have just been the only thing that they noticed that they found. So the point was that this was just getting dug up. There wasn't really such a thing as modern excavation then. There wasn't. It was just a bunch of workmen who dug him up, and you can look at some of the pictures, and there's just this picture of this pile of bones with a skull on top. That's what it, essentially just hoiked him out. There was no real excavation. So people, there's been plans and talks about actually going back and excavating their trenches to see um, how they excavated it and what they might have missed, because there could have been other things there potentially that they might have missed. So all we have is the skeleton. And to be honest, this happens sort of fairly often. Something similar happened at Stonehenge, where they went back to some of the um, little pits that used to hold some of the blue stones, these sort of big stones that are now moved into the center. They were sort of moved into the center of the monument about 2300 BC. But they were excavated back in, I think, sometime in the 19th century, and then they were re-excavated sort of in the 21st century, because basically they dug up all the cremation. There was loads of human cremations in there. They dug them all up. At the time, they didn't know what to do with them, because at the time you didn't really know what you could do with cremated bone. And
Mm.
fortunately, they reburied them. So I mean, the standard thing to do back then was to chuck them out, because they didn't think you could do anything with them. But in this case, they put them back in the hole, and they were actually re-excavated recently, so people could do sort of stable isotope analysis on the cremated bones. But I mean, it used to be the same thing with burials as well. People used to Back then, people were only interested in the skulls, so they used to dig up the bodies, chuck away all the other bones and just keep the skull a lot of the time.
That's weird. I do have to say, when I looked at Cheddar Man, I've seen pictures of him because it's a pretty complete skeleton, right?
Mm.
Seems like a pretty robust individual. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, fairly. So I mean, there was a bit of uncertainty about his sex actually, in terms of when we look at the morphological characteristics of his skeleton. There was a bit of a mixture of traits. So I think it was his skull showed a lot of masculine traits, and his pelvis was showed a few sort of slightly feminine traits. But I suppose this was one of the big things of the DNA that we sort of confirmed that he was definitely male in the sense that he had a Y chromosome. But it was actually funny at one point that there was one sample that we took that was slightly contaminated. And as you probably know, when you have a slightly contaminated sample, you tend to get this signal in terms of sex, in terms of the chromosomes as being sort of intermediary between sort of male and female. So we sort of freaked out a little bit at one point and thought he might be like an intersex individual, but then we realised it was just it was just slightly contaminated. So yeah, well, that would have been even more bizarre if we'd have reported that as well.
Well, I mean, I don't know why you're freaking out because that would have made the documentary even more impactful, and
Yeah,
we'll
yeah,
talk a little bit about that later. I mean, that would have been international news. That would have been a really big deal.
yeah,
You would have
yeah.
been you would have been super famous as the ancient intersex guy.
Yeah, 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 that would have been good. Yeah, that would have been fun. Could have, yeah, followed my David Bowie-esque aspirations.
So,
Anyway.
you're kind of, I mean, you do a lot of things, Tom, but I mean, you're kind of known for Cheddar Man now. I want to talk about somebody who has passed on, Dr. Brian Sykes,
Mhm.
who was a geneticist at Oxford, and he's kind of like I don't know, media geneticist, media figure, for starting from the late 1990s, until he kind of faded from public view in the early teens, I believe. And he did some documentaries, I believe, and I don't think they got to the United States very much, or I didn't see them. But he wrote some books, Seven Daughters of Eves. I think he wrote another book about the Saxons, Vikings, and Celts. Maybe it was titled. I actually reviewed it for the Scientist many years ago,
All
but
right.
yeah. So he's done some stuff. He did some stuff. He did some personal genetics company, Oxford DNA,
Yeah, yeah.
that's defunct. So he's done a variety. He did a variety of things. He was also involved in Cheddar Man. And he did some genetic work on Cheddar Man, and there was this whole thing about how people in the area were descended from Cheddar Man. I think Cheddar Man had a U5 mitochondria, and I think
Mhm.
they got the mitochondria back then because there's a lot of mitochondria. It's a copious DNA, right? I don't know if they ever got the Y chromosome. Can you talk a little bit about Brian Sykes and his relationship with Cheddar Man?
Yeah, so I think it was he was I think a pioneer in using particularly modern um, mitochondrial haplogroups to try and uh, have a stab at reconstructing past population dynamics, particularly ancient population dynamics. And I think as part of it, he was also very good at sort of publicizing the results to some extent, and writing these books, which, to be fair, now, I mean, even though they're sort of out of date, they are pretty accessible. So I still had my mum the other day actually said to me that one of her mates came up to her and said that she was reading one of his books and said that she was really enjoying it. And my mum was saying, "Oh, I bet if you were there, you'd have said it's all rubbish now." And I was like, "Yeah, well, yeah, but I mean, it's hard to deny that the way that he writes his books is accessible, even if to some extent, particularly from in hindsight, they're a little bit misleading. But yeah, I mean, as part of this, what he did was he obviously went for the low hanging fruit, the most sensational thing he could by going after the Cheddar Man skeleton and sampling a tooth from there to see what his mitochondrial haplogroup was. And what he did as well, he went to this small village that I mentioned, this small village of Cheddar, and just sequenced the mitochondrial DNA of loads of people in the village too. And yeah, the sequences that he got from Cheddar Man through polymerase chain reaction PCR suggested that it was this haplogroup U5, and he also found this school teacher, and I think one other person, I think it was a kid, so it was anonymous, who was also U5. So this was promoted in the papers as suggesting that um, this man in Cheddar, this Adrian Target, was essentially the direct maternal descendant of Cheddar Man, and that his family had lived in the area for essentially 10,000 years and hadn't, yeah, 10,000 years and hadn't moved since then, which, was a nice story to capture the public imagination, but, wasn't really strictly true if you know anything about the way that maternal lineages work. And also, I mean, I hadn't realized this. Someone mentioned to me, um, Adrian Target wasn't even born in Cheddar. He'd moved there from from somewhere else. So they sort of left that bit out of the story because I guess it didn't fit so well.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that being reported in the American papers, because whatever. I mean, the story traveled all across the world, and this is 20 years ago, early 2000s, and nobody knew their own haplogroup back then because there was no personal genomics. People weren't getting these kits or anything like that. It was super expensive. The technology to analyze it wasn't exactly easy. So, this was a whole production. You needed a geneticist from Oxford to do it. And it was just kind of fascinating. And it captured people's imagination. I think that's what you're reflecting. It's, oh my God, like these people are descended from cave people that lived here after the Ice Age. And, they're just like evocative in our minds. Now, you say that it's wrong, probably, or, you can't really make that extrapolation. And there's some technical reasons with maternal DNA. But I think one of the things that we need to talk about is who Cheddar Man is genetically, what population he belonged to, and what that population, how it relates to the people in England or Western Europe today, and how, I think our views have radically transformed since Brian Sykes wrote Seven Daughters of Eve, that book that you're alluding to, which is a fascinating book. But I will just set it up real quickly for you.
Hmm.
In the early 2000s, there was a debate about whether the people in Europe are the descendants of late Pleistocene hunter gatherers, from the Ice Age, or are they just the descendants of farmers from the Near East, agriculturalists? And there was an argument between Cavalli Forza and some of his colleagues about who argued for a large demographic impact, and then other people who we're saying, oh, it's cultural diffusion. There was, like a lot of these academic things, there's a lot of argument back and forth, and Cavalli Forza took issue with the way Brian Sykes depicted his own position. But I mean, that's a separate thing that I don't really want to get into. But basically, Sykes said mostly descended from Ice Age people. About 75% of the ancestry is probably Ice Age people. And then, they looked at the Y chromosome and, with R1b and kind of came to the same conclusion. And so that's where we were in the early 2000s. So when you looked at Cheddar Man, your prior is going to be, well, this is the ancestor of the modern people in England.
Yeah.
That was what people thought. And so everything was interpreted in that light. We know something different now. And can you talk about that, Tom?
Yeah, well, we know now. I mean, we already knew when we sampled Cheddar Man because there'd been other individuals from different parts of Europe about the same age or a bit younger than Cheddar Man that had been that had their DNA sampled, and we knew that they belonged to this genetic cluster that's often referred to as the Western hunter-gatherers, um, and they are a population that essentially are sort of outside the variation that we see in Europe today. Because essentially they still have a genetic legacy in populations of Europe today, but because of migrations into Europe that have happened since they were alive, the genetic ancestry of people in Europe has changed so much that sort of they now sit sort of slightly outside of European genetic variation. And so this was exactly what we looked at the DNA from Cheddar Man, and he belonged to this group of Western hunter-gatherers, as well as we sort of expected. And so this was sort of because already, without even looking at sort of Neolithic or Bronze Age DNA from Britain, we knew that this model that Brian Sykes proposed was incorrect because he was totally different or very different in terms of his DNA from the people who live in Britain today. So we knew that this model of DNA in Britain persisting all the way from the end of the Ice Age, particularly all the way to the modern day, just wasn't true. But I mean, as you say, it's hard to judge him too harshly on the science because at the time the only thing that was available was these uniparental haplogroup approaches, particularly looking at modern DNA that where there's a lot of confounding effects that affected the interpretation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I know. I think it was in 2004 or three. I think maybe Barbujani. There was one group that came with a 50% farmer
Mm, yeah.
ancestry, and I remember like we were trying to. I was trying to figure out like why was it 50%? Like how could they infer such a large number? Or do we have something wrong? Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing, and I've talked to David Reich about this is it's just you can't make the inference from modern
Mm,
distributions to the past because there's too many migrations, right? I mean, it just there's too many turnovers, there's too much scrambling going on to actually make a at least a fine grained inference. I mean, we can make like a really, really high level inference, but at the level of like a region of Europe, you can't do something like that. And so there's this turnover. So these Western hunter gatherers, let's just call them Western hunter gatherers. One thing that I do want to make clear to the listener is that they are the last in a succession of ancient hunter-gatherer populations of cultures, and genetically these groups have some distant relationship to each other, but it looks like they also engaged in turnover, so that these people, the Cheddar Man's people, are relatively recent in their dominance of Western Europe, these Western hunter-gatherers, let's say after the last glacial maximum, you know 20,000 years ago. They show up, at the end of the Pleistocene, and they spread all over the place and mix in and kind of replace the previous people, synthesize with them. And so, Mesolithic, Western hunter gatherers, these are the people that we see all across Europe, Western Europe, and they're kind of genetically homogenous, right, Tom?
yeah, yeah. So it's interesting in that when we were analyzing his genome, we were sort of comparing him to other Mesolithic genomes from different parts of Europe. And also this has been done recently by Laura Cassidy as part of the Irish Neolithic Mesolithic Genome Project. I mean, essentially, they're genetically very difficult to distinguish from like this Western hunter-gatherer from Switzerland, Switzerland Lochbohr one, yeah, and other hunter-gatherers from Europe. So I mean, this is sort of quite a homogeneous population distributed over sort of quite a large area. Yeah.
Well, so for the haplogroup nerds out there, my understanding is the vast majority of the mitochondrial DNA of these Western hunter gatherers is U5, which I think was the inference of Cheddar Man. And then the Y chromosome, the paternal lineage, tends to be I think I1, but maybe not defined as one or two, but haplogroup I, right? So it's from a small founding population with these maternal and paternal lineages, right?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it's I, and I think all of there aren't that many Mesolithic genomes from Britain, but all of them are within that and similar to other Western hunter-gatherers from Europe, as far as I know. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I do have to say is I was kind of excited when Cheddar Man came out, partly because okay, I've been hearing about Cheddar Man since I was like a wee, not necessarily a wee lad, but
Weird.
yeah, I was in a different stage in life when I first read about Cheddar Man. Like those are the days. But I wasn't like entirely shocked because we can kind of extrapolate it's going to be a Western hunter gatherer. And so, it was kind of scientifically interesting, but I think it had a huge cultural impact because of Cheddar Man's role, I think, in British archaeology. And Britain has this huge tradition of antiquarianism and archaeology. And here in the United States, we do have some archaeology, especially with the indigenous people, Native Americans. But then there's some political issues where, honestly, people have to be careful. I don't think you guys have the same problem, and also you have a lot more history. Where I grew up in Eastern Oregon, seeing a building or a structure that was constructed in the 19th century was amazing. That was super old. It's a little different where you are, I think, from.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's the old thing that we have like furniture that's older than your country in terms of your political in terms of your nation state. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the main thing is a lot. I mean, we do have. I mean, literally museums. We have a bit of a crisis in museums in terms of how much stuff there is, including human skeletons here as well, which makes a difference because essentially there's uh, uh, the planning laws here mean that if a developer wants to develop some land that has potential archaeological significance, and they find anything significant archaeologically while they're sort of digging the footings, then the developer has to pay for a commercial archaeological unit to come and dig that up and record it, and all the fines sort of get transferred so to a local museum. So essentially we are constantly digging up new things all the time, because it's completely linked to infrastructure development and buildings development in the country. So as long as that's going on, we're getting more and more skeletons. I think this is partly why Britain has very quickly become uh, sort of one of the highest density areas for samples of ancient DNA, and in that we have this history of archaeology as well, but also it's so embedded in our planning policy, meaning that things are just getting coming out of the ground all the time.
Well, so I mean, it sounds like you went into the right line of archaeology at the right time, Dr. Booth.
I was totally in the right place at the right time when it comes to ancient DNA. There's my role in this entire thing. It was like sheer luck, really, that I got in on the ground floor just as sort of NGS, next generation sequencing, and the kind of archaeogenetic revolution was happening. Because until I started this project at the Natural History Museum, I hadn't had any experience in ancient DNA. The only reason why I was hired was because I'd had some experience looking at degradation of bone, and so I got recruited onto this project because partly because I was a human osteologist, so I could pick out samples, and I had contacts, people I could contact to get samples for this British Ancient DNA project, but also because I might be able to find which samples had the best preserved DNA, because I understood these processes of degradation. But in the end, sort of a few months after I started, uh, the paper came out showing how good the petrous portion of the temporal bone is for DNA, and all of my experience in bone degradation just went out of the window, because it was sort of to some extent pointless, in the sense that if you just sample the petrous, then you're going for the best part. So, but fortunately, it meant that I, like I said, got in on the ground floor as an archaeologist, picking up all of these new developments in ancient DNA.
Well, I mean, so Cheddar Man is this Western hunter gatherer representative of this Mesolithic tradition that's present all across Western Europe, and becomes turned into a TV show, I believe. Becomes a cultural phenomenon. One of the things that was hugely controversial is the physical reconstruction
Hmm.
of Cheddar Man. And I mean, I thought this was kind of weird, but I'm a weird person, so I'm probably not the weird one. It got involved in racial, I guess, issues with Britain today.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's funny. I mean, there's a lot of, I like seeing all the rumors floating around the internet of what actually happened with them making this documentary, because there's a lot of people who say quite confidently about what happened, and it wasn't like that at all. So it was funny in that when they were starting the documentary, they were doing the documentary anyway on Cheddar Man before we were doing any of this DNA work, and they started doing sort of bits and pieces of filming for it. And we were literally doing the work as they were filming. So we would get a result, we would tell them we got a result, and then they come in and film a bit and film a bit. So we were literally sort of slightly doing it by the seat of our pants, and doing it that way. But yeah, so we initially just looked for these two. We're looking at, because they wanted to know, because we're going to make this reconstruction anyway, and they wanted to know if they could use the DNA to inform this reconstruction. So I mean, we already had an idea, because of other samples that had been done, that he wouldn't have these two main variants that are largely associated with lighter skin pigmentation in particularly Northern Europeans today. Um, and so we did some initial tests, and that's what we found. They didn't have these variants, suggesting that in all probability he probably would have had darker skin than what we associate with kind of Northern Europe today, and maybe Europe generally. But then sort of the producers wanted to know sort of, well, how dark. So we actually started off with this. Based on that initial analysis, we started off with this like beige cheddar man. There was initially like this beige cheddar man. So which wasn't quite as dark as the reconstruction that you see now. But then we sort of searched for this tool to try and see if we could get a more accurate prediction of his skin pigmentation. We found this Hirisplex tool that I think other groups had used previously to look at predicting eye and hair pigmentation, but at the time it had recently got skin pigmentation added. So we ran the Cheddar Man through this tool, and to be fair, it didn't really narrow down the prediction all that much. It essentially just got rid of potentially the intermediate category and then covered all the other categories. So it was these categories based on this Fitzpatrick scale, and it fit into this sort of dark to black prediction, but probably not the darkest prediction on that line. And I mean, so we got that result. So we sort of sent the result to the Kennis brothers who were making the reconstruction, and so they did the reconstruction based on that result. And yeah, just the fact that Cheddar Man, we debated it with darker skin. I suppose the issue was with that reconstruction was that it was a huge range in terms of possible skin pigmentations, but we could only do in one color unless we paid tens of thousands of pounds for sort of several different busts, which wasn't really an option. So I think the Kennis has just stuck him somewhere in the middle of the range that we gave them. But yeah, this ended up being hugely controversial because of the idea of the first or of these very early people in Britain having had dark skin or darker skin, particularly than we're used to seeing in Britain and Europe generally. Yeah.
Well, so I'm laughing because I'm just imagining the production asking you for a bust, and you're just like, "Well, here's 25."
Well, exactly. It's like how many can you do, to reflect the whole range? Yeah,
Yeah, because they would just look at you like you're kidding.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, because I have also I have been involved in productions for scientific things, and it's just interesting because I'm a nerd, so I'm just like, well, kind of this, but maybe this, and they're just like, no, there's no maybe. Just tell us the truth, and I'm like, well, I can tell you a probability, and they're like, no,
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
no.
right.
And so I feel you there. So let me so I've used High-Risk Plus myself. Just it's pretty accurate. And modern people, like, I can tell the listener that I've run it on my children, and it's actually like a pretty good prediction
Mm,
of their pigmentation. They segregate. They have like relatively high heterozygosity, so they segregate a lot on the various the loci. But one thing that I would say, and I did a podcast about Cheddar Man for the Insight a couple of years ago, when you guys first did this because of all the issues. I do have a problem with some of the extrapolations
mm,
backwards of a tool trained on modern populations. And I think my view is pretty mainstream, actually. And I know that, there are other people who've been evangelizing this view, like Graham Coop. Like, you just got to be careful. You run High-Risk Plex on some ancient population, and it turns out they're supposed to look like, I don't know, West Africans, but it's just that you might not be sampling the alleles or the positions. Mostly it's the alleles. We know the genetic architecture of pigmentation pretty well, so it's not like there's going to be some magical new genetic positions, right? But so what I would say, and if someone asked me, I would say that I'm like, I mean, they lack the derived variant of SLC45, A2 and 24A5. I mean, it's hard to imagine that they would be as depigmented as modern Northern Europeans. And also, the best technology that we have today shows that their selection sweeps even
mm.
into
Yeah,
the
exactly.
present for pigmentation on modern Northern Europeans. So, I mean, I think the priors should be like, okay, there's no way that these people were, they weren't rosy cheeked British lads, I mean, so I mean, I
Apple
think
cheeks.
that's
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, that's a plausible that's a plausible theory. And then, of course, eye color is quasi Mendelian. 75% of the variation in Northern Europe is due to the locus of OCA2 HERC2, which I think you guys looked at, and the Western
Mm,
hunter gatherers. They tend to be derived. We say, from the ancestral, so they tend to be like predicted as blue eyed, right? And
yeah, yeah.
so I think it's plausible to say, like, these would be swarthy, darker complected people, probably with very dark hair, because your prior should be that a human has dark hair unless you have some other evidence. I mean, the
Yeah,
vast
yeah.
majority of humans do. So, but blue eyes. So I mean, that seems reasonable. I think what was happening in the online, some British, let's just say British broadsheets of a certain caliber, um, they were they were filtering it through the light of modern racial politics in Britain, and then correspondingly there was a certain unruly, uncouth online quarter that was quite offended that Cheddar Man had been turned into, not what they had been expecting and told when they were young.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm sort of, I mean, he may have been like lighter skinned than what was depicted in the reconstruction, as you say, because there were variants that, or at least sort of potentially, like the a genetic environment in which these sort of alleles existed, which may have been present in Western hunter-gatherers that isn't present in any modern human population now, but as you say, probably still quite dark skinned. I kind of uh, yeah, it was presented in like I said in a particular way in the broadsheets, but the way I kind of saw it was um, you know I didn't really comment on it, but I did see that people who had that had some sort of some African ancestry or were darker skinned or ancestry from places like South Asia were sort of seeing this and feeling um, some level of satisfaction against people who in the past had racially abused them on the basis of their skin color and ancestry and said you cannot belong in this country because of what you look like, because of your ancestry, you don't belong here, kind of thing. And I kind of feel like that fair enough if that's how they feel, that if that makes them feel better about it and makes them feel that they belong to a country in which they absolutely do belong, and that they feel British, and they feel more entitled to feel British or English when that's their absolute right, based on their citizenship or whether they were born here, then I think that's fine, personally. But yeah, I mean, you see a lot of rabid people online talking about how Cheddar Man is used to justify mass migration, and it's like, I don't think I've seen anybody make the argument, make that link specifically. You could say that there are clumsy arguments which uh, respond to people being negative about migration by talking about Cheddar Man and sort of saying, we're kind of a nation of migrants and things like that. But I feel like it's coming to the same core thing, that the people that they're um, sort of talking with are saying, or essentially trying to say, that uh, white British people should have more rights in this country than, black British people, South Asian British people, on the fact that of our ancestry and our and what we look like, and sort of, they are, I would say that they're framing it in those terms to begin with, when really we should understand citizenship, belonging, nationhood in our country, based upon recent historical events. The skin pigmentation of some 10,000-year-old man shouldn't really come into it. But, it's funny, we talk about the Brian, sorry, I'm really rambling now, but talk about the Brian Sykes stuff. All that was used by those same people to throw in people's faces for, 10 years, saying, uh, our ancestry goes back to the Ice Age. We're the proper populations of Britain. You shouldn't be a get out kind of thing. And that was used by, it was even turned up on the British National Party website for a long time, which was this, as the name suggests, far right nationalist party in the UK, which was quite prominent in the sort of noughties, and they were using that specifically. So I think part of the way that Cheddar Man got incorporated into these debates was in part a reaction to the way people have previously weaponized, Brian Sykes and Stephen Oppenheimer's ideas previously, and which people continue, and the idea people continue to use, that in order to be British and belong in Britain, you needed to have white skin and a particular kind of ancestry. So yeah, I mean, to some extent, that stuff is people coming from my side of the political argument, but I think there is some legitimacy to it as well, personally.
Yeah, I mean,
It's hard.
my own.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, my own stance is like this is kind of illustrating the fraught nature of justifying your politics based on scientific evidence
yeah,
because
yeah, yeah.
that can change. So, are you going to change your politics now? No, you're not. So that means that it really didn't matter in the first place.
I know your politics isn't actually based on the ancient past; it's based on the present, which everyone's politics is really. It's got nothing to do with that. I mean, that's why I find it quite funny. A lot of people relying on current models of ancestry in Britain to sort of think about their identity and concepts of nationhood and who they belong to. And they're just like in the noughties, they're holding themselves as hostage to fortune because we don't really know what's happening in, say, well, in a lot of detail, what's happening in sort of in Britain in the last 3,000 years. There could be uh, other things that are happening that means they have to again, does that it won't change their politics, but it won't change their politics at all, even though the facts of the matter have changed potentially. So yeah, that's why you shouldn't hang your um, political ideologies on the identities of and ancestry of ancient people, but people still do, and I think a mature understanding of ancestry of identity and nationhood is rooted in the recent history of your country. And in Britain, that completely explains why there are Black Britons, South Asian Britons, East Asian Britons, and English and Welsh and Scottish. It's all understood in in our last sort of 500 years of history or so, and it doesn't really matter so much, even if there is massive diversity in the past. It's sort of irrelevant to this, in my view, to this question of who belongs in certain countries, I suppose. But yeah. It's weird. I
Well,
think
so
we come to similar conclusions, but from different coming from different directions.
Well, so I want to I want to talk about migration and the bell beakers because that's super relevant. Another kind of like change to the narrative that happened. But while you were talking, I looked up your surname Booth.
Yeah.
So it says arguably of pre 7th century Norse Viking origin. So are you yourself the descendant of migrants from Scandinavia, and are you therefore biased in your views?
Yeah, I just trying to make sure they don't kick me out. Yeah, in favor of people
Because
here before. Me, but
I
yeah,
have been
Booth.
reading the history books, and the Norse did cause some serious issues in merry old England.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think that where I'm from was at some point in the Danelaw, at least part of it was. Um, so yeah, and there's lots of near where I'm from. There's lots of strange names that basically I think have a Norse derivation. So there's a place called Oswald Twistle is a good one, and Barn Oldswick. I think Barn Oldswick is one as well. Maybe that are all these sort of strange sounding names that actually derive from the influence of Danish Norse. And there's also actually just a place near where I'm from called Booth as well. So it could just as easily be that as well that I'm associated with that. But yeah, but yeah, no
Well,
idea
so
about the Danish stuff. I'm R1b in terms of my Y chromosome, so that would suggest it's maybe not. It's possible, but maybe not.
yeah, I mean that would change the priors a little bit. I think my probability will be altered if I go to a conference and catch you having beers with Anders Bergstrom and Pontus Skoglund. I'm like, oh, that's a little suspicious, you know.
There might be
just, just,
other factors that might make me want to have beers with them too. But yeah,
so I want to talk about the beakers,
yep.
bell beakers. You were on this paper, um, and this is dating to a very different period. And I did a podcast a couple of years ago now with Lara Cassidy about Ireland, and so I'll post a link to that podcast for the listeners so that they get some background on that because it's kind of a similar story, but you know we're talking about demographic change and the results from the beakers, the bell beaker paper. I found pretty shocking. I don't know.
Mm.
Like, did you find them shocking?
Massively. I remember when David Wright came over to tell us the results, and there was a bunch of archaeologists there, a sort of a selected few who I knew who worked in this period, and I think they all the sort of mouths were hanging open. I have to say. I mean, I think it's a bit unfair to say that no everyone had ruled out the idea of there being migrations in the Beaker period had been completely ruled out. There were still people arguing that there was a lot of mobility in this period, but nobody had anticipated that it would be on the sort of scale in terms of ancestry change on the scale that we see here, where there's like over a few hundred years you get a 90% turnover in the ancestry of people living in Britain. Definitely, I
What
don't
is
think
that?
even sort of back in the antiquarian days, people would have necessarily envisaged that it would have been that massive.
Yeah, and so to set the context here for the listener, 90% replacement, but they were not even replacing the Mesolithic hunter gatherers, the people of Cheddar Man. They were replacing a different population which had replaced the Mesolithic hunter gatherers of Cheddar Man, of his people, right? So you're having these multiple replacements, and so can you just like give a general sketch of what the findings of the paper were?
Yeah, so you have this first replacement, which I think I've seen of the Neolithic populations who have this ancestry from sort of Neolithic Anatolia and the Aegean, and I saw a recent figure that suggested that is an at least 99% replacement of the Mesolithic populations of Britain. So you get an almost total replacement of the people there. And then that's around 4000 BC, and for about 1500 years, those populations inhabit Britain. They build Stonehenge, and then you get this new ancestry coming in of people carrying this ancestry that derives from around the Pontic Castium steppe around 3000 years ago. And when they start to arrive over by between they start to arrive, it seems around 2450 BC, and by the time that you get to around 2000 BC or so, essentially uh, that ancestry of those people that are coming into Britain has replaced sort of 90%. I think it's even over 93% is the official figure of the ancestry of the Neolithic populations who were there before. And that was one of the main findings for Britain, at least. But it was interesting in that in other parts of Europe you get this beaker culture developing, which develops at the same time in Britain as these migrations. But you get this beaker culture developing in sort of Central Europe, spreading in from seemingly around Iberia, without there being sort of significant ancestry changes, suggesting that that was dispersed without any sort of major uh, movements of people, but that then uh, these people in Central and Northern Europe that acquire these or aspects of these beaker cultures is actually kind of like a hybrid culture between beakers and cultures derived from sort of corded ware, which is this culture in the East and Central Europe. Then move into Britain and are responsible for, at least partly responsible for, introducing this culture into Britain.
Yeah, so I mean, the beakers, I mean, anyone who wants to, maybe I'll just like post an image also with the show notes here. But I mean, they're pretty awesome. They're these like kind of like charismatic archaeological finds. So of course you're gonna call it the beaker culture. Like, I don't know what if modern Western culture, like tens of thousands of years in the future, like if they're doing digs, like I don't know what we would be called.
iPhones, maybe. Yeah.
Or the IKEA culture,
Yeah. Right.
you know
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
so, but, I mean, so, like, they're obviously ubiquitous, they're charismatic, they're preserved, they're very, like, kinda luxurious looking, they look like luxury goods maybe for their elite, and so the beakers are spread all across Western Europe, as you said, so the beaker culture is kind of, like, a little weird, insofar as it looks like it kinda started in Iberia with maybe a people that were of more like Anatolian farmer type ancestry. So, classic Southern European. It's the
Mhm.
highest fraction in modern Sardinia. And then somehow it jumped culturally into people with more of a Pontic steppe, corded ware liminal origin, somewhere in Western Germany, probably. And then it becomes associated with that ancestry by the time it comes to England and Ireland, right? Do you think that's a correct summary?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And so
Exactly. Yeah.
we don't know, like, the beakers are just a tracer, a cultural tracer. Like, we don't know, like, what why these totally different, genetically totally different people, probably speaking, I mean, almost certainly speaking a different language, Indo-European
Mm.
language, whereas in Iberia they're probably speaking non-Indo-European language at the time. So we don't know like what's happening there. My hypothesis, based on no ability to use time travel, is probably it's like something religious. Religions we know can spread from one ethnic group to another with a relatively high fidelity.
Mm.
So I would suspect that it would be something like that. Because like, why would you replicate these luxury goods of a totally different culture unless they had some like deep spiritual significance to you? I mean, they don't look super functional to me.
Yeah,
You know.
I think that's exactly it, and that's long been hypothesized that it's funny because calling the beakers, so people reduce it down to beakers, is like what's so special about the beakers, but it's sort of signifying something else, and yeah, it's the idea that it's this belief system which people can come to somehow. There's something about it which people aspire to. Um, and there are other things associated with it, particular burials of people. Um, Not exclusively, but you get these sort of burials of people that seem to be dressed as sort of posed as archers, whether or not they were actually archers or not in life, but it seems like it was something like an aspirational ideal for the when you sort of transfer to the when you die and transfer to the other world. So yeah, there's these hints that there is something ideological, and there's something attractive about this ideology that's associated with these particular beaker pots.
Yeah, so I mean, so this beaker ideology, like this beaker cultural motif, spreads into the Western kind of zone of the corded ware. You know, like cultural zone. So these steppe people, right? And so let me just be explicit. Beakerism is associated with the R1b haplogroup. I mean, not exclusively, obviously, but
Mm,
it didn't spread. I mean, it spread eastward, but at some point it just stopped. It didn't go. I don't think it went into like eastern Poland or into Russia, obviously. And so if it was a religion or something like that, it hit its limit, which
mhm.
that happens. So let's face westward now. Like, so the beakers are going west. My understanding, like going into the chronology, and this is one thing that I find fascinating. Like, yeah, like we know the general sketch of European genetic history right now. Like, we don't. We know. I think we know pretty much everything in the medium scale grain, right?
Yep.
But there's so many details of timing, and so it looks like they came to Britain a bit later. So the Indo-European languages probably came to Britain several centuries later than they became dominant on the continent, which means that there was a period when Britain was this probably pre-Indo-European, archipelago, the British Isles,
Mm,
where the mainland was already Indo-European speaking, right?
mm. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, the same thing probably happens to some extent in the Neolithic as well, because we assume that probably the Mesolithic populations of Britain were speaking different languages to the Neolithic, and there's basically a 1,000-year gap between farming practices arriving in proximal places of continental Europe and it arriving in Britain. So there's this period where large parts of mainland Europe are probably speaking this language associated with the farmers, whereas Britain is still probably speaking this language associated with the hunter-gatherers, largely anyway. And yeah, similarly in this period.
And so, if you look at France, if you look at the ancient DNA transects in France, and just like the whole genome, it doesn't look like it wasn't a 90% replacement. It was more like
Mm,
60%, something like that. So it was more of an admixture. There was a recent preprint that came out. It was a paper. It was a paper, maybe not a preprint. The preprint was in
mm,
the summer, using the Paris Basin and also in the south, I think, of the Provence, some samples. And it's nothing like the 90%. This 90% that you see in Britain is extreme.
yeah.
And so I think there needs to be some sort of like archaeological prehistorical examination of why it was like such a massive turnover. And so just to emphasize for the listener, the Neolithic people are descended primarily from Anatolian farmers. Do we have a good sense now? Because the genetics here is difficult because these people expanded so rapidly that there wasn't
Mm.
that much differentiation. Do we have a good sense whether the farmers came up through the cardio culture in Spain, or did they come up from the post LBK cultures in Germany that came to Britain?
So it seems they are mostly derived from the sort of cardial cultures, people associated with the cardial cultures that came up through sort of from southern France, then up through into northern France. It could be, I mean, it could be from Iberia as well, or it could just be that sort of the Iberian ones branched off from the ones that were in southern France, and the southern France went off into Britain. But there does seem to also be a slight signal of the sort of LBK um, signature in there as well, but it's not very high. I mean, we tried to estimate it in one of the papers looking at Neolithic Britain, and we estimated it as about as up to a third comes of their ancestry comes from the kind of LBK associated populations, but it was a pretty it was very tenuous inference. So yeah, there does definitely seem to be a bit of admixture. So it seems like that there's a point in France, and other papers that have come out from France suggest that sort of these two farmer populations associated with sort of the cardioware cultures and LBK mix somewhere in France, and then but for whatever reason there is a much greater proportion from the Mediterranean cardial people, and then move into sort of Britain and Ireland after that. So it's definitely that they're definitely more sort of cardial looking than they are LBK looking, but there maybe is a little bit of LBK in there.
Mm. And so, these people are here in Britain, and they built Stonehenge, right?
Yep. So, well, there are several different phases, but the first one's about 3000 BC, where they build the henge. The henge isn't the stones. The henge is the earthwork monument, which is a ditch and a circular ditch and a bank. And probably when they built that, there was also a stone circle, just of single small stones, or maybe just a timber circle. And then about 500 years later or so, that's when they bring in sort of the big guns and the huge stones that are the triliths that you associate with Stonehenge today. These sort of big uh, kind of N-shaped stones with the lintel across the top. They are around 2,500, just before we see the first evidence for these Beaker people arriving in Britain. But yeah, it looks like they were probably built by the Neolithic population of Britain.
But the Beaker people, who arrived from the continent, they continued to use and maintain Stonehenge, correct?
Yeah, I think to some extent, I have a feeling that this population turnover doesn't happen very quickly. So the issue that we have is that there aren't many. Basically, in this period from about 3000 to 2500 BC, just when the Beaker people come in, most Neolithic people are either being cremated or being subject to some funerary rite that leaves no trace in the archaeological record, because we have so few human remains. Actually, the most human remains we have from this period are from Stonehenge itself, and they're all cremated. So the problem is that we don't get any DNA from that period specifically, but also if these people continued to sort of persist in Britain after these Beaker populations arrive, we might not see them in the DNA because they were cremating their dead and carrying on cremating their dead or treating them in ways which we don't see them in the archaeological record. And actually, through this period up until around 2100 BC, you see odd people that have sort of quite a substantial amount of ancestry from um, Neolithic populations of Britain. So you see these sort of little pulses of admixture uh, all the way down through from 2500 to 2100 BC. And then around 2100 BC, you stop seeing these people with a lot of ancestry from Neolithic Britain, and the general amount of ancestry from Neolithic Britain in the population slightly increases. So it suggests to me that you have, like you have in other parts of Europe, sort of these two populations that are living largely in parallel with one another, and only sort of admixing infrequently, but one of them is archaeologically invisible. But then around 2100 BC, they sort of come together uh, more sort of liberally, but something about what has happened over the last 500 to 1,000 years means that this Neolithic population has a tiny, as a only like a 10% genetic legacy, in that I think it's got maybe at least something to do with differences in population sizes. But it suggests, I think, that definitely it could have been the Neolithic populations and their descendants maintaining Stonehenge to some extent through this period. But definitely there's evidence that populations associated with the Beaker cultures were also interested in it. So you get a lot of burial, even from right at the beginning, you get a lot of burials of people that have essentially no ancestry from the Neolithic population of Britain getting buried in these cemeteries near Stonehenge. And particularly, you get these burials referencing monuments and structures from the Neolithic. So right from the beginning, it seems like that the Beaker people that are coming are sort of um, adapting and taking on aspects of the sort of Neolithic people's cultures that they find there. It seems like they, and I think you see this in other parts of Europe as well, they're very adept at sort of maintaining like their beaconess to some extent, but then also incorporating some of the local things that they find there, including things like Stonehenge, but other monuments as well. So there does seem to be this sort of cultural exchange, but we only really see one side of it genetically because we only have these populations that are burying their dead and not cremating them.
Well, so my understanding, one thing with these farmer populations, these Neolithic people, is something happened around 3000 BC, in England at least, or in Britain, and they might have gone through a population crash and shifted towards a more pastoralist, less intensive lifestyle. But now you're telling me maybe there's an ascertainment bias, there's a sampling bias in the remains. What do you know about this phenomenon?
Yeah, I think it's both. So yeah, there's definite evidence that there you have this in various parts of continental Europe, but particularly in Britain, you have this boom and bust agriculture where the population grows very quickly. The Neolithic population grows very quickly when they first arrive in Britain, but then there's some crises potentially related to climate and affecting crop yields, which mean that there's a population crash around 3000 BC, and that potentially the people living in Britain that there aren't necessarily all that many people living in Britain from the period 3000 to 2500 BC when the people with the beaker population start arriving, and that would explain maybe if you have these two societies living in parallel, if they one of them isn't that numerous, then they may not even necessarily always be encountering each other that often in particular areas. Um, and yeah, would again explain why when interaction and sort of the integration to some extent between these two populations finishes, that the Neolithic population has a much smaller genetic legacy than sort of these beaker populations that come in later. So I think it's a mixture of both these things. I think there is a persistence of the Neolithic population of Britain alongside these sort of beaker people, but that also they just weren't potentially all that numerous. And like you said, they were maybe because of the failure of sort of agrarian agriculture, they'd switched to living a much more pastoralist, mobile, and sort of like lower density um, in terms of population lifestyles.
Hmm. Well, so we were talking earlier about Cheddar Man and his phenotype, his physical appearance, and you got so many more samples now of these Neolithic people and of the beakers. Can you talk a little bit about that? What they look like? I think they were lactose intolerant. Let's talk about some of the physiology, stuff like that.
Yeah. So yeah, what's weird is that in terms of lactose intolerance, is that there is definite evidence for lots of evidence for dairying, archaeological evidence that is from the Neolithic onwards in Britain. But this allele that we know is highly associated with lactose tolerance um, in particularly Northern European people today um, stays flat, and it's hardly anyone is lactose tolerant all the way through the Neolithic period, um, and even into the Bronze Age. Into the early Bronze Age and up to the Middle Bronze Age to around 1,500 years ago. Lactose tolerance, I think it maybe increases a bit, but not by very much, which is really odd. Um, yeah, even through the Bronze Age, lactose tolerant level frequencies stay low. So there's this, and I don't know if we're going to get into a conversation about why this happens, because the mechanism is always a constant source of discussion with geneticists. That it seems like that lactose tolerance in Britain has essentially gone from zero to more or less. I think it's 75% amongst modern British
Hmm.
populations in the space of
Hmm.
3,000 years, which well, at least 3,000 years. It could be less than that, which is just a massive selection pressure for lactose tolerance, much higher than you would maybe have anticipated, considering you would expect the selection to have begun at the beginning of farming when people actually started milking their herds.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
yeah, and in terms of pigmentation characteristics, the population that comes into Britain during the Neolithic has one of these um, genetic variants associated with lighter skin pigmentation. One of those is fixed, and the other one is variably present, I think. but it is not often there. So it suggests that they were probably had, on average, lighter skin pigmentation than people who were in Britain during the Mesolithic. And then similarly, when the Beaker people coming, they have higher frequencies of this other allele that was low in the Neolithic populations of Britain that's related to lighter skin pigmentation. So again, it's likely that on average they probably had slightly lighter skin pigmentation than the Neolithic populations of Britain. And I think we,
What?
sorry, go on.
Well, so yeah. So I mean, the Beaker people. One thing that I'm curious about, because just looking at it, it seems like the modern genetic variation that you see in the United Kingdom, in Britain, it, it looks roughly about right when the Beakers show up, or when they absorb the Neolithic people. Like about 2000 BC, 1800 BC. It's like, yeah, there could be some differences, some changes, some rearrangements, but I mean, say, let's talk about, like, this is outside the purview of this conversation, but when the Vikings or for the Anglo-Saxons come, yeah, there's some genetic perturbation, but really these are all different Northern European people swapping in for each other, so they're not that different. And the Beakers are just one of those, just more distant in the past. I mean, do you think that's a correct characterization?
Yes, yeah, to some extent, in the sense that all the sort of more or less the ancestry components that you see in uh, British populations today are sort of, or at least white British populations today are sort of there. Um, but the issue becomes is that you could have a situation where the ancestry in Britain is completely replaced by a population who, in terms of those ancestral components, look very similar to the British population, and you might not see it yet, if you know what I mean. Um, if they're too similar, or if you haven't got enough
Yeah.
ancient genomes from that period. But yeah, you're right in the sense that they, you have basically Britain is now within the variation of uh, Northern European populations that you see today. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so I mean, if you look at a principal component analysis, the Neolithic populations Neolithic populations of Britain would land near, say, modern Southern Europeans, or much closer to modern Southern Europeans.
Yep.
And then you take the Beakers, and they're pretty close to just Northern European populations, right?
Yeah, they kind of scattered across, yeah, Northern European variation from
Yeah.
what I know from the PCA. Yeah, yeah,
Well, I mean, and which is like reasonable, because
yeah,
what we call Northern European populations now only really came into being as a particular mix of ancestral elements 1,000 years before, or around 3000 BC and
yeah,
later, right? So I mean, we're talking very early times when these different groups are separating, differentiating, admixing with local populations. So you're sampling at a period when it's a little incoherent. But my only point here is, okay, so you have the Mesolithic people, Cheddar Man, who we discussed earlier. They're very different from anything that's come later. And then you have the Neolithic people who derive from Anatolian farmers. They're very distinct. They're very different than these Bellbeaker people who succeeded them. And so you have, at minimum, three major genetic successions during the Holocene in Britain, right?
uh, yeah. During the Holocene, yeah, yeah. Um,
Yeah. Well, I mean, during the Pleistocene, Britain was not inhabited, correct? Actually.
well, no, but then you have this. Oh well, it was through the pre LGM for a while,
Okay.
around between around 40,000 and 30,000. There's evidence for sort of pre LGM occupation, and there are some skeletons as well, but they are
Mm.
very partial skeletons. But also, we don't really have any results for Britain, but you have these skeletons from Britain, well, these bits of skeletons from Britain, actually from the same cave as Cheddar Man, that date to around 14,000 uh, years ago. And around the same time in Europe, it's actually a different population than the one that Cheddar Man belongs to, that is occupying a lot of Western Europe. So you would hypothesize perhaps that you have this other population that occupies Britain at the end of the Ice Age that is then replaced by the population that Cheddar Man belongs to, the Western hunter-gatherers. Like I said, we don't have the data yet to know that one way or the other, but that would be my prior idea of what happens based upon what happens in other parts of Western Europe.
Yeah, I mean, basically, this is like the story here is all is change.
Yeah,
I
it's just,
mean,
I mean, it's funny. I mean, there's, I mean, I always adapt that quote about prehistory that it's not only weirder than you imagine, it's weirder that you can't than you can imagine. And I think you see that with all these population changes. And I mean, particularly in periods where it's sort of hunters, gatherers, and foragers, that these replacement events that seem to happen in the Holocene are quite mind blowing. But when you see them also happening, in the Pleistocene between hunter gatherer populations, it's like beyond what everyone would have ever expected.
well, so to close out this conversation, we have all of these ancient DNA. We have all this ancient DNA from Britain. We have modern surveys, such as the peopling of the British Isles. We have the biobank. Britain is a genetic superpower. I mean, partly it's probably just like the history of the fact, genetics was rediscovered, quote unquote, like to a great extent, Bateson in England, right? So
Mhm.
it has like a deep reservoir of talent and history and institutional knowledge. Um, where are we going forward? Because I mean, honestly, like I've read about British genetics, since the early 2000s, Brian Sykes, Steve Jones, like all of these guys,
Mm.
who I'm sure you knew and watched, on TV
Yeah.
and whatnot. Um, but like, where are you guys like as you're progressing forward? Like, I mean, I mean, the low hanging fruit's gone. Where's the medium hanging fruit? Where's the high hanging fruit? Like, which canopies are you going to?
Well, I mean, in terms of the top level stuff, then it's an ancient UK biobank is what we're trying to head for, and this is what we're trying to do at the Francis Crick Institute at the moment with Pontus Skoglund leading laboratory there. Is to, I mean, we're never going to get enough ancient samples to reach, the hundreds of thousands that you have in the modern UK biobank, uh, but certainly trying to get um, thousands of ancient genomes from thousands of individuals in one place to try and look at these questions that you wouldn't be able to otherwise, things like polygenic selection and very fine-grained ancestry, which might pick up on things that you would otherwise miss in studies with lower sample size. So I think that's where, I mean, as you say, in terms of population um, histories, I don't think there isn't necessarily all that much to tell about Britain, or at least not so much that wasn't already known to some extent. But I think it's going to be about utilizing both the UK biobank, the modern biobank, and the ancient biobank together, and trying to produce new insights into sort of selection, uh, disease-related traits by sort of harnessing both those things together. And I think that for reasons I mentioned earlier, Britain is suited for doing that because we have such a large resource of ancient remains.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I am curious about though, are you worried about ascertainment bias of your samples in your GWAS for ancient DNA?
Well, yeah,
That's
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 kind
not that's not a serious question.
of. I can answer that, but I would try to answer that. But I mean, the point is that hopefully, getting all these people from one place, we'll be able to understand the genetic architecture of Britain specifically, but just nobody else. So it's good for if you're a British person like I am, you'll know everything there is to know about me and be able to predict exactly what diseases I'm likely to suffer from and
Well,
all that stuff, I
we've
suppose,
we,
to a quick extent.
we've already talked about your surname, sir. I'm not sure if you can call yourself a British person.
Oh no! Oh,
Let,
you're gonna set the trump
let's
for
say
me.
let's say British passing person. But
Yeah, I can pass.
yeah,
I can pass.
yeah. So I mean, like, if you're gonna do a GWAS on ancient, like, so this is kind of an interesting idea because you cannot phenotype these people. I mean,
Yeah.
you can maybe like I mean, you can get some morphological characteristics from the skeletons and maybe there's preserved hair, but so are you saying that the training set's going to be modern? So you're going to look at the variation in the modern to discover the variance and then use that to look at the variance in the ancient populations and look at the differences between the modern and the present to maybe infer selection?
This is slightly above my pay grade here, but I don't think it's going to be so much that. I mean, maybe. I mean, it's been done before in like the Viking paper. They had a go at doing that. I think it's more going to be looking at signals of selection over time in ancient genomes and trying to figure out what is being selected for and why and how that relates to distributions of variance in the modern populations. Yeah, I mean, the GWAS is
Mm.
interesting, but as you say, as for Cheddar Man, extrapolating modern based GWASs to the past is potentially a risky business.
Well, I mean, the Viking paper with Eske Willerslev and his group was interesting, and you've been involved in media stuff in the past, but that presents an opportunity that perhaps you will be depicted as a thrall or a slave somewhere. I don't know. Just
Oh man, yeah, I know. The thing is that how do you beat that? I mean, I don't think anyone can beat SK on that kind of promotional ability, but he set a standard of archaeological reconstruction. Putting yourself into it for your paper that I don't think is ever going to be surpassed. I don't know how you're ever going to do it unless I dress up as a sort of a Celt. I don't know,
he's
and try it out.
Eske Eske Willerslev is the Robert De Niro of ancient DNA. He's a method actor.
Well, this is the thing is that he could have got started small, but no, he went straight to the extreme, didn't he? He didn't
Yeah.
start with just like little pictures of him, I don't know, just dressed in some gear. It was literally my, I think he was a postdoc at the time, has me as his thrall. That's what I'm going for. No one's ever going to top this, and he's probably right.
So I don't know. I don't know where this picture is, but I found a picture a couple of years ago of Eske Willerslev where his shoulders are bare,
Mm.
and so it looks like he's nude. Like I don't understand the context, and I would periodically just post the pictures on my Twitter timeline, and a lot of people wouldn't know who it was, but everyone who knew what it was would just be
Yeah,
like
knew what it
laughing.
was. Knew what it was. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, I did highlight the thrall picture and think, oh, maybe I'm breaking some code here that you're only supposed to. This is supposed to be like an ADNA signaling thing, so no one else knows. But I mean, Eske is so famous in Denmark that um, I think that people will catch on anyway to some extent. Yeah, there's some pretty. I mean, there's some pretty cool pictures of Eske, that you just couldn't imagine. For instance, David Wright getting involved with. I think I mean they're
No,
competitive over a lot those two, but I don't think there's any competition when it comes to getting your picture taken in furs.
Eske is an artist.
Yeah, yeah, true. Yeah, like you said, he's gone total method. He's gone total Daniel Day-Lewis in this stuff at the moment, isn't he? Total method.
So I mean, you guys obviously have a lot of resources, and you're doing a lot of cool stuff in this island of Britain. I mean, do you I mean, you're still a young man yet, still a young and academic. Like, do you have thoughts and possibilities of maybe going beyond the British Isles and taking some of the resources and the skills that you've developed and the knowledge and applying it to other populations?
Um, I mean, this is going to sound really boring, but not really. Partly because I'm the thing is that, and I think this is something that DNA geneticists don't really get, is that archaeologists are by nature quite parochial, or most of us are, and we have our little specialisms, particularly in little areas, and that's why it's sometimes very difficult to take these sort of national scale ancient DNA studies and apply them to your local context. Because if it doesn't include any burials from your local place, but then these papers are saying this is how this change occurs in your region, it's like we haven't got any burials from my region, so how do you know, kind of thing. This is sort of partly where the disconnect is, and I think that really the way forward is to try and integrate, for me, because I primarily am familiar with the archaeology of Britain, is to try and integrate these local archaeologies with more fine-grained ancient DNA data to see what kind of interesting questions and interesting answers that throws up in terms of
Hmm.
things like ancestry change and kinship and social organization, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't like gotten into it, and I've had you for a while, so I need to let you go. But listeners, man, like some of the stuff that people are doing with kinship and genealogy is crazy. So, we're talking about these broad course population analyses, but now there's so many individuals and so many genetic markers that people are figuring out, who's the cousin of who, and are they maternal or paternal based on their mitochondrial DNA. And so these hypotheses that archaeologists and anthropologists have about just the social structure of these ancient people are being validated by genetic tools. So, I mean, the extent of patriarchal, patrilineal existence of some of these Indo-European people in particular is shocking to me, and that's pretty much been validated by ancient DNA.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see where this is going to go. I mean, the issue with some of it is that it's I don't know. I mean, it's been applied to very specific places where you have the sampling, but yeah, you have some similar results from certain places. But yeah, when it's also sort of mixed in with the archaeology, grave goods, things like that, and stable isotopes, you get these you almost start to get a glimpse of almost
Yeah,
prehistory happening in generations rather than just this
yeah,
like broad reach. Yeah, no, which is pretty tantalizing stuff when you're used to dealing with when you're dealing with prehistory, very vague ideas. Talking about things occurring over centuries rather than what you have with these sort of familial lineages that you get and familial trees that you build, where you can see sort of what's happening over several generations of sort of funerary behavior. Yeah,
hmm
it's pretty cool. I mean, that's the kind of thing that really archaeologists, that fine grained regional stuff that archaeologists would um, really get into.
yeah. I mean, as we're closing out, I'm thinking of like what your career and like what British geneticists, British archaeologists, ancient DNAists, whatever you want to archaeogeneticists, what you guys are gonna do. And I mean, you have the skeleton in place. It seems like you're going to put on a lot of flesh to the point where, in a couple of decades, you're going to bring these like individual human beings to life in a way that I don't think we can imagine very well right now in 2021. Just as in the year 2000, we couldn't imagine some of the things that we're talking about.
I know. I mean, 2000, in genetics terms, it's well, like when Brian Sykes was working, it seems like a million miles away. I mean, I remember going through my undergrad and learning about ancient DNA analysis, and particularly in Britain, weirdly, it was just seen as something of a lost cause for a long time because basically, geneticists were relying a lot on PCR methods. They find it very difficult to control from contamination. You don't know whether the sequence that you're getting out is genuinely ancient or it's just something that's sort of flaked off from your fingers as you are handling the bone or whatever. So, they were insisting that anybody doing an excavation had to excavate skeletons in full like hazmat suits, which was, if you ever been on a sort of a cemetery excavation at an archaeological site, it's totally impractical. It's never going to happen. So it's weird in that at the beginning of ancient DNA, ironically, Britain was quite slow in taking it up. I felt because there was, and there still is to some extent, a lot of cynicism because of some of the failures, because of what happened sort of through the noughties, where people were insisting on this like totally clean approach, and then when they got the results, it was just these sort of uniparental haplogroups, so they're like, could be related, might not be related. So it wasn't really giving them, it might have this ancestry, might have that ancestry. So it wasn't really giving them what they wanted. So there was sort of a slight delay in Britain taking it up because of this slight cynicism amongst archaeologists about it. But now that it has taken up, it's this sort of rapid sweep because we have the resources, particularly
hmm
to look at this stuff. Um, but yeah, so it's amazing that, like I said, the difference that because the prospects were incredibly gloomy back in the noughties when I was sort of doing my undergraduate and masters for this kind of stuff. So it's just incredible. I mean, where we'd be in 10 years from now is just sort of probably inconceivable, really.
hmm Well, I mean, I guess the big takeaway from this, aside from all the rich scientific information that you've given us, which is great, and I'm keeping track of your work. Anyone who follows me is by definition following you, Dr. Booth, because I follow you very closely. But um, hope you never know where techniques and tools lead, and the scientific enterprise is filled with surprises. So you're in a really good position right now, and you never would have predicted this 10, 15 years ago. And so who knows what we'll be talking about in 10 years. I think whatever we're talking about, I think it'll be exciting.
Cool, definitely, yeah.
All right. All right, thank you for jumping on the podcast and having this conversation. I think like the listeners are going to love this, and I really enjoyed talking to you after just following you on Twitter and social media and reading your papers all these years.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Razib. Thanks for having me on. Yeah.
All right.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite